Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is APBio, 7th period review of Chapter 25, Flowering Plants, Nutrition, and Transport. Yay! Say hi.
Hi.
All right, so we did a little bit of history, and you can review that on your own. Talking about the things that plants need, I think you can figure out about oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide and the purposes of each and where they enter the plant. I would be comfortable with that, okay? On the leaves, things go in and out the what? Stomata. Usually the problem is not oxygen, because you get oxygen through the process of what? Oxygen through the process, you gain oxygen through the process of photosynthesis, right? The problem, you're so smart. The problem is that sometimes you can have an issue of actually too much oxygen and not enough CO2, and then the plant will do what process? Photorespiration, thank you. Photorespiration. And that's not helpful to the plant, and that is when RUBP, instead of combining with CO2, it binds with O2. And we have already talked about in previous chapters ways to avoid that. Do you remember the two that I discussed with you? CAM? C4. What do CAM plants do to overcome that? Keep their stomata open at night and fix the CO2 at night to PEP. Okay? And what about C4?
Different, like, structure.
The leaf structure is different. You have Krantz anatomy, and the RUBP is in the bundle sheath cells around the xylem and the phloem, and then the other cells around it, then the bundle sheath cells will become the area where you do your dark reaction, and it's escorted in, right? Using PET, and same idea, same strategy, is only supplying it with CO2. What gas or gases do roots need? Do they need CO2 for photosynthesis? No, because that's usually like looking at like, do they? No, because the roots are in the soil generally, where it is very dark. Okay, so the only gas they need is what? Guys, you don't have to be here, so go if you need to, okay? So the only gas they're going to need is what? Oxygen. For what process? Cellular respiration. Perfect. Okay. Water. Where does the plant get water? Roots. Yeah, not the stomata, through the roots. Okay, so I'm trying to get you to think big picture. Okay? So gases come in through the stomata, O2 and CO2, in, out. Through the roots, primarily oxygen is going in, right? CO2 would come out. Does that make sense? Because the roots are doing what process? Cellular respiration. Okay, water comes up through the roots. Yeah? Okay. Now, when we think, okay, remind me later. When we think about other things plants need besides oxygen and carbon dioxide and water, that's when we think about minerals. And there are different experiments that are done to identify what's critical. We talked about this mnemonic, C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by my cousin Clydemo, that you're going to need other elements and other minerals out there that make up the plant that they're going to have to acquire. Minerals are going to come in through the what? Soil. Yeah. And when we look at soil, we can see most of it is mineral particles. And there's air in there. That's good, because we need what gas? Oxygen. Good. There's water, and plants need water, right? It comes in through the roots. And we talked about dead and decaying matter and what kind of things can contribute to the formation of soil. We know particle size is critical. If the particles are too big, the rocks are too big, they create a lot of space, and you can't hang on to the water, and then you don't have access to it. If it's too small, they pack together so tightly, the water kind of gets trapped, and there's plenty, but there's no air spaces within that. So you want it to be just right, which is a mixture of all of these particles. Clay can be very good because it can hang on to some of the minerals that you need. We looked at this. So if clay particles are charged negatively, then they can hang on to positive. And then remember when we talked about the proton pump? So as long as I can pump hydrogen out, then I can exchange it for something positive, like positive potassium ions. If I need to get some other minerals in, they can be the +1 on the hydrogen ion gradient. So we saw one benefit of the proton pump. We talked about all the things that contribute to the formation of soil. Other plants help with breaking up and creating space in soil. You have decomposers, which overturn the soil. Other things die in the soil and provide nutrients to it. Bacteria. Cyanobacteria is really important to soil. What does it do? Fixes nitrogen. In trade. Fungi can be a really important component to soil because they can be in association with plant roots. And what is that called? What is it called? Mycorrhizae. Yeah. So that would be another component of soil that would be critical. Yes, ma'am.
Would fungus be like classified as a decomposer? Is that
yes. Fungi is a decomposer. But even though that might be its primary role in most ecosystems, it can also have a role in symbiotic relationships, which might be different, where, like I said, it increases the surface area. And then any decomposer is going to be helpful to an ecosystem because it makes nutrients that were caught up in living things recycled back into the soil. All right, all good questions. Anything else on that? Okay. So then we talked about the roots themselves. And so there's something that leaves have that roots don't have on their surface. You think of something besides stomata, that's a good one. I wasn't even thinking about that. There was something I was thinking about that has to do with water. Waxy cuticle. Who has a waxy cuticle? Leaves, right? And why do you have a waxy cuticle on leaves? Yeah, prevent water loss, right? And so the only openings are openings you can control. What are the openings to the leaf that you can control? Stomata. And those are controlled by what cells? Guard cells. So that's how you control that you don't lose too much water out of your leaves. You do not have a waxy cuticle on the roots because you want all of that to increase surface area so you have what of water? More absorption. What's something that can increase the surface area? Root hairs. And tell me something else that can increase the surface area. Mycorrhizae, what we just talked about. Okay, that association with the fungus. All of those increase it. Why does water want to go into a plant? That answer is so perfect. Because there's lower water potential in the plant root than there is in the adjoining soil. And that is created falsely, but for a purpose, right? By using your proton pump and using that to get other minerals to come in as the +1 with the hydrogen, you can make the cortex of the root what? I'm looking for a word. Starts with an H. Hypertonic. Water must flow from the hypo, right? So hypo would be considered high water potential. Something that's hypertonic would be low. Now the cortex, though, could be hypotonic relative to the stele, the center of the root, right? And that's hypertonic, so water would flow, right? And we refer to that as water potential because we've got a couple things that we're dealing with there. It's not just straight up membrane. We also have a cell wall that can push back, right? Trigger pressure. Okay? So when we look at the root, though, there is some area that has waxy that are related to the roots. What's that area that has a waxy layer even in the roots? It's not on the surface. Casparian strips. Exactly. On the endodermis, not the epidermis, but the endodermis, you have Casparian strips. They don't cover the entire endodermal cell. If they did, water would never get into the stele, right? They're just on the edges. And that's because at that point, you want to make sure water's not able to go between cells. What is it called when it goes between cells? Apoplast. You want it to go through a living cell that you can control, and what do you call that? Very good. So now we have the water in the steel, and now we have it moving into xylem. And we were able to get that water, high water potential to lower water potential, using things like the proton pump to facilitate that process. Okay, I already talked all about that. Talked about that. So now we're ready to move the water up the tree. So to move primarily water, we're going, and minerals, because that comes in through the roots, what would we use? I'm sorry, I wasn't helpful. What structure would you use? Xylem, right? And xylem, we have two, we missed the beginning, it was really awesome.
We had to go through Spanish and like check out quizzes. Yeah, sure.
Okay, all right. So, nothing but love there. Sure. Okay, sorry, it's Friday and we're tired and a little testy, getting ready for our quizzing.
Hot testy.
Okay. Out, Jeannie's out. Okay. My 5th period class, we talk about, who's in my 5th period class? Yes, you know. The Jeannie gets out and then I start talking about random inappropriate things. Okay, so, no, I got it all together in the morning. My coffee's in me, I'm feeling strong. Okay, back to the review. Xylem, 2 categories, basic categories of xylem, called, one starts with a T, one starts with a V. Tracheids and vessels. You know what you can think of? This is your trachea, right? And this is a conductor of air, because air is really important to us, but what's really important to plants? Water. So they have a vessel. Maybe that will help you. Tracheids and vessels. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. So tracheids and vessels, and they will transport water. The thing about tracheids vessels that most people would find ironic is that they are what? Dead. Thank you. They function best when they're dead. You don't have to have living tracheids and vessels to function. And when we want to remember that theory, we don't do the new school name because it's easier if we do the old school name. And the old school name, what are the letters we remember? T-A-T-C. So let's address each one. What's the first T? And that is the evaporation of water out stone water, right? A little water or a lot of water? A lot of water, right? A lot of water moves up and out. So what facilitates water coming out of that? What can help with that? The sun. I don't know how to make the sun. The sun, right? I'm cold. Okay, sun. Okay, the sun's shining. But will it still transpire even if the sun is not out?
Yes.
Because it's following the, you're the one who brought it up. Water potential. Yeah, it's following the water potential gradient, right? So outside, the water potential is lower than inside the plant. Now, we just did our lab, right? And the misty people, the gorillas in the mist, they had transpiration of like 0.85 milliliters, except for super tall plants. 0.85 milliliters per gram, right? As opposed to light, which had like 8, 9, 10, 11 milliliters per gram of transpiration, right? So we can say light definitely affects the rate of transpiration. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. You can support that claim with evidence now, and then explain the reason why. So we have transpiration. What's the next one? Adhesion. Adhesion is doing what? Water adhering to the, and that provides what? Support to the column of water, right? So it's hanging on. Okay, what's TA? What's the next one? Tension. And tension is just referring to the tension on the plant due to the water potential gradient, right? Higher water potential at in the roots as opposed to the leaves. So it's that pull following water potential. TAT, C stands for cohesion. And that's hydrogen bonding between 2 water molecules. Okay? So to me it sounds like you understand the TATC theory. Do you need me to review that? Oh, I know something I want to, well, first let me ask you, do you need me to review any aspect of that? Okay, and I have a bunch of questions I can ask you too that we didn't do yet. Okay, now this is guttation. Guttation is a result of root pressure. Let's think in our mind, what is root pressure? So we've talked about pressure potential, right? Osmotic pressure. We've talked about pressure differentials before. This is due to, hello, how did it go? I prayed for you this morning. Sorry, just a moment. Okay, do you know?
No, I won't know until March.
How do you feel?
I felt good about it.
She just took her can I say that? Sorry. She just took her administrator's test, her second part. So I want her to be my administrator. My bestie. Okay. My sister from another mother.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So come back to me. Sorry for all that. Root pressure. We know what generates root pressure, right? A proton pump, a gradient in minerals, hypertonic water comes in. It's not going to move back out because the water potential is always greater outside the plant unless, of course, you have no water in your dirt and the plant's going to die, right? That's going to happen. But otherwise, the water's going to move in, and the only place it can go is what? Up. But root pressure is not strong enough to overcome gravity to get water to the top of the tall, tall trees. That's why the TATC theory has to overtake. Yes? Okay. So eutation is evidence of that. Is that water coming out of stomata?
No.
It's just coming out, it's getting forced out the ends of the leaves. It's under that much pressure. All right. Now, let's talk about that fun stomata picture. Okay, so stomata open and close, and there are various factors. That could be hormonal, it could be temperature, it could be the amount of water in the plant. Remember, I gave you a whole list of things that could vary why stomata would be open or closed. But the mechanics of opening and closing, again, has to do with what? The proton pump, right? So once again, you're pumping hydrogen ions out. Who are replacing the positive charge inside the stomata? Potassium. And then who follows the potassium? Water. The water goes into the central vacuoles. The vacuoles swell and push against the cell walls due to turgor pressure, right? And so that causes the guard cells to swell open, and they create the space. When the potassium leaves the cell, so too does the water. They become flaccid, and the stomata closes again. Do you need me to walk through the steps of that? Proton pump. Pump hydrogen ions out of the guard cells. Good. Now, to replace the positive, instead of having proton go back in, who goes back in? Potassium goes in. Who follows potassium? And the water is going into the, which is then pushing against the, and then that increases the what pressure, and they swell open.
Okay.
Got it now? Okay. And the opposite of that to make them go flaccid and close. Got it? Now, let's talk about the pressure flow hypothesis. Okay, yes, aphid death. Okay, so whereas the movement of water is about pulling, the movement of sugar is about pushing. Yeah, water is primarily transported through the xylem, right? So if I had a list on a quiz question, let's say, and I asked you to pick out the false statement, you would not associate water movement with phloem. Now, I know that there is water involved because water is following the sugar to increase the turgor pressure to push it to the next cell. But that's not the purpose of phloem, to transport water. That's just a mechanism to get sugars to go to the next cell. You can recycle that water that you have used to generate sugar movement to get it to the roots, but its primary job is not to transport. That's just a happenstance, right? Because that's not its main, it's not what's occupying the space. What's occupying the space is the sugars. It's a living cell. Okay, and the odd thing about phloem is that it's associated with what? Well, besides it being alive, where's my phloem? Is that there's a what cell? And it's hypothesized that by moving the nucleus out of the sieve element, it leaves more space for what? Sugar, which is what it's trying to move. So you have the companion cell associated with it. Again, you're going to use a what? Proton pump. And when the hydrogen comes back in, its +1 is going to be what? No, think about it. We're in phloem. So what's the +1 going to be in phloem? Sugar. Yeah. So now we make the sieve element very sugary. Who's going to follow that sugar? Water. Now, source and sink. Sugar is always going to flow from the source where the sugars are concentrated to the sink where they're less concentrated. What would make them less concentrated? Well, if the sugars were getting burned up through cellular metabolism because you're a growing shoot, that could be a sink because you're just using up that sugar to grow. Or another sink could be what? The roots, because you're going to store the sugars, right? Okay? Either one of those could be sinks because you're storing it. But the roots could also be in a different season. The roots could be the what? Source, because they're releasing sugars because it's winter time and I don't have any more leaves, so I've got to get the phloem flowing up instead of flowing down. Does that make sense? So source and sink is relative, just like hypertonic, hypotonic, right? Would be relative to whatever's going on around you. So the source is generating the sugars. The sugars are getting moved into the sieve element using a proton pump, a +1 strategy. Water follows. When the turgor pressure builds up, it's not going to go back towards the source because the source is jamming even more sugars that way. The only option it has is to go towards the sink because there's lower pressure there because the sugars are getting removed. So it's a pressure, a push-powered process, not a pull. Okay, questions on that? Okay, let's do some questions that I have in here. We'll start backwards.
What are we coming in as?
We're coming in on our fun Friday afternoon activities that I would want to hear about. Fun Fridays. And I'm going to pause you just for a minute here.
Is there a Friday activity?
Resume our recording.
Oh, Howard! Oh, thank God.
It was transferring. I told you so, Adam.
Okay, now let's talk about the key word here. What's the key word here? Main force. What drives water moving out of the open stomata? Transpiration. The evaporation of water. That is surprising to me that we did not get 100% on that one. The sugar produced by mature leaves moves into sieve tubes by way of active transport. How is that active transport? We actively transport the hydrogen, and the sugar comes in as a +1. So that's going to cost us energy, and that's why those cells have to be alive. And water follows passively by osmosis. Yes?
So just to clarify, the hydrogen and the sugar moves into the sieve tube through
Yes.
active transport.
Let's back that up. Hydrogen moves out due to active transport. Sugar comes in based on that active transport, the gradient that you set
So
up.
hydrogen moves out of the sieve tube.
Yes, sugar moves in.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's try another one. I'm going to pause you again. Here we go.
Yeah, that doesn't happen on the
No. It's fifth period. Okay.
We just discussed this.
Now you know how I feel. Exactly. We just discussed this.
Right, we just discussed it.
Wow. Here we go. Oh, is there more? Yeah, there's more. Here's some more. I'm going to pause you again so I can talk about shoes.
Wait.
Na, na, na.
Let's look at cost.
Oh,
Na, 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 for the longest time. Is somebody trying to miss these things? I'm just curious.
There's one that's missing.
Every time. Okay, here we go. Let me see if I have another one here somewhere.
Number two.
Oh, my bad. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just one person who's being
Okay, somebody needs a hug. Okay, they're asking for attention. All right, that's it on there. You know what I would do? I would do the questions at the I would write out my essays. Boom. Okay, we're it. Thank you. Oh, tell them goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a piece of toast.
Have a piece of toast. Exactly. You wave to it.